The morning mist clung to the cemetery gates like desperate fingers, refusing to let go of the night's sorrow. Marcus Hartwell stood at the entrance, his breath forming small clouds in the cold October air. 3 months had passed since he buried his 18-year-old daughter Emma, yet every step toward her grave felt like his first walk through hell. The black suit hung looser on his frame now. Grief had carved away pieces of him, leaving hollow spaces where laughter used to live. His wife Sarah had begged him to stop these daily visits, claiming they were keeping his wounds fresh. But Marcus couldn't explain that staying away felt like abandoning Emma all over again. The silence at home was unbearable, filled with her absence. At least here, surrounded by the quiet dignity of the cemetery, his pain felt purposeful. The gravel path crunched beneath his polished shoes as he navigated between weathered headstones and elaborate monuments. Some graves were adorned with fresh flowers, others stood forgotten under blankets of fallen leaves. Marcus had memorized every crack in the walkway, every tree that cast shadows across the sacred ground. This place had become more familiar to him than his own neighborhood. Emma's section of the cemetery was newer, with uniform granite headstones arranged in perfect rows. The groundskeeping here was meticulous, grass trimmed to regulation height, no weeds permitted between the markers. It was the kind of orderly peace Emma would have appreciated. She had always been particular about her room, every book in its proper place, every pen returned to its designated cup. As he approached her grave, Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The headstone bore her name in elegant script: Emma Rose Hartwell, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. Below it, the dates that bookend her too brief life seemed to mock him with their finality. He had chosen every word carefully, agonizing over the inscription for weeks. How do you summarize a lifetime of love in a few carved letters? "Good morning, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice carried away by the autumn breeze. Talking to her had become natural, necessary even. In life, Emma had been his confidant, the one person who truly understood his dry sense of humor and shared his love of old movies. Now these one-sided conversations were all he had left of their relationship. He knelt beside the headstone, pulling a few stray leaves from the base. The groundskeepers were thorough, but Marcus took pride in keeping Emma's resting place perfect. It was one of the few ways he could still care for her. As he worked, he noticed something that made him pause. The earth above her grave seemed different somehow, not quite level with the surrounding plots. Marcus frowned, running his palm across the grass. The surface felt strange under his touch, slightly elevated, as if the ground itself was taking a deeper breath. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the morning light casting shadows that made the terrain appear uneven. Graves settled over time, didn't they? The funeral director had mentioned something about that during their awful planning sessions. Still, the observation nagged at him as he arranged the fresh chrysanthemums he had brought. Emma had always preferred wildflowers to formal arrangements, but the cemetery regulations required something more subdued. He promised her silently that someday, when the rules didn't matter anymore, he would plant a whole field of dandelions just for her. The wind picked up, rustling through the oak trees that bordered the cemetery. Their leaves were beginning to turn, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust. Emma had loved autumn, claimed it was the most honest season because it didn't try to hide the fact that beautiful things must end. She had said that just weeks before the accident, sitting on their front porch as they watched the neighborhood transform. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to summon her voice more clearly. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he could almost hear her laughing at something ridiculous on television or calling for him to help with her calculus homework. But those phantom sounds were becoming fainter, and he feared that forgetting would be yet another way of losing her. The cemetery was beginning to show signs of life as other visitors arrived for their own rituals of remembrance. An elderly woman 3 rows over tended to what must have been her husband's grave, speaking to him about their grandchildren's latest accomplishments. A young couple stood hand in hand before a small marker, their silence heavy with the weight of dreams that would never be realized. Marcus had nodded to many of these regular visitors over the past months, a brotherhood of the bereaved who understood each other's presence without need for words. They shared an unspoken etiquette of grief, giving each other space, while offering the comfort of not being alone in their sorrow. As he prepared to leave, Marcus took one last look at Emma's grave. The strange elevation in the earth seemed more pronounced now, impossible to dismiss as mere imagination. He made a mental note to ask the groundskeeping staff about it on his next visit. Emma deserved a perfect resting place, and if something was wrong with the burial site, he would make sure it was corrected. Walking back toward the cemetery gates, Marcus felt the familiar hollow ache that accompanied leaving her behind each day. But today, something else gnawed at him, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve about the ground that refused to lie flat above his daughter's grave. 2 days later, Marcus returned with a sense of unease that had been building since his last visit. He had barely slept, his mind returning again and again to the strange elevation he had noticed above Emma's grave. Sarah had found him standing at their kitchen window at 3 in the morning, staring out at their own backyard as if answers might emerge from the darkness. The cemetery felt different in the afternoon light. More visitors moved between the headstones, some carrying elaborate floral arrangements, others simply seeking a quiet moment with their departed loved ones. Marcus navigated through them with practiced efficiency, his destination fixed in his mind like a compass needle pointing north. When he reached Emma's grave, his blood ran cold. The mound was unmistakably higher than it had been 2 days ago. What had been a subtle elevation was now a pronounced swelling in the earth, impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The grass growing atop it seemed lusher, greener than the surrounding turf, as if something beneath was feeding it with unusual vitality. Marcus dropped to his knees, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pressed both palms against the ground, feeling the soil give slightly under pressure. It was softer than it should be, almost springy, like earth that had been recently turned. But that was impossible. The burial had taken place months ago, and the ground had long since been officially closed. "This isn't right," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the wind rustling through nearby trees. He looked around frantically, hoping to spot a groundskeeper or cemetery official who might provide an explanation. The logical part of his mind offered reasonable possibilities: seasonal settling, root expansion from nearby trees, even natural decomposition processes that he didn't understand. But the father in him, the part that had protected Emma from scraped knees and broken hearts for 18 years, sensed something more troubling. What if someone had disturbed her grave? What if the burial hadn't been properly completed? The thought made his stomach clench with a mixture of rage and terror. He spent the next hour examining every inch of the plot, searching for signs of tampering. The grass showed no obvious tears or repair work, but the soil beneath felt wrong. Too loose, too alive. Other graves in the immediate vicinity lay flat and undisturbed, their surfaces marked only by the gentle depressions that time naturally carved into the earth. Marcus pulled out his phone and took several photos, trying to capture the anomaly from different angles. The images looked ordinary on the small screen, failing to convey the visceral wrongness he felt when standing beside the swollen ground. He scrolled through his contacts, considering who he might call. The funeral home, the cemetery administration, his brother-in-law who worked in landscaping. Instead, he found himself dialing Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice tight with the careful control she had maintained since Emma's death. "Marcus, is everything all right?" "I'm at the cemetery," he said, knowing this would worry her. Sarah had made her feelings clear about his daily visits, viewing them as an unhealthy obsession that prevented proper healing. Something's wrong with Emma's grave. The silence on the other end stretched so long, he thought the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke, her words measured and gentle. "What do you mean, something's wrong?" "The ground is raised, higher than it should be, higher than it was 2 days ago." Even as he said it, Marcus realized how it sounded. Grief-stricken father imagining problems that didn't exist. He could practically hear Sarah choosing her response carefully, weighing the need to be supportive against her concern for his mental state. "Honey, maybe you should come home. We could call the cemetery office together if you're worried." "You think I'm losing my mind?" It wasn't a question. Marcus had seen the same expression on the faces of friends and family members over the past weeks, that careful blend of compassion and alarm reserved for people who might be cracking under pressure. "I think you're a father who misses his daughter desperately," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "And I think sometimes grief can make us see things differently than they really are." After ending the call, Marcus sat on a nearby bench, staring at Emma's grave from a distance. From here, the elevation was less obvious, merely a gentle rise that could easily be explained by natural causes. But when he walked back and stood directly beside the headstone, the wrongness was undeniable. Something was happening beneath the earth, something that demanded investigation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery, and Marcus realized he had been there for nearly 3 hours. Other visitors had come and gone, but he remained transfixed by the mystery of his daughter's restless grave. As closing time approached, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Tomorrow, he would confront the cemetery administration directly. If something had gone wrong with Emma's burial, if someone had disturbed her final resting place, he would demand answers. The thought of his daughter's peace being violated filled him with a protective fury he hadn't felt since her death. For months, he had been drowning in helpless grief. Now, finally, he had something concrete to fight against. Walking toward the cemetery gates, Marcus felt a grim determination settling over him like armor. Whatever was causing Emma's grave to swell would be discovered and corrected. He owed her that much, and more than that, he owed it to himself. The mystery had awakened something in him that he had thought was buried alongside his daughter, the fierce protectiveness of a father who would move heaven and earth to ensure his child's safety. The growing mound had become more than an anomaly. It was a call to action. By his 5th consecutive visit, Marcus could no longer pretend the changes were subtle. Emma's grave had risen nearly 6 inches above the surrounding plots, forming a distinctive mound that caught the eye of other cemetery visitors. He had watched an elderly man pause during his own pilgrimage, staring at the unusual elevation with obvious confusion before hurrying away, unwilling to become involved in someone else's tragedy. The grass atop the mound had grown thick and vibrant, an almost artificial shade of green that contrasted sharply with the dormant October turf surrounding it. When Marcus knelt to examine it more closely, the blades felt different between his fingers, softer, more pliable, as if they were being nourished by some hidden source of vitality beneath the earth. His daily photographs had become obsessive documentation of the grave's transformation. Scrolled side by side on his phone screen, they told an impossible story of Earth that refused to remain still. Sarah had stopped asking about his visits after their tense conversation, but he caught her watching him with increasing concern as he left each morning in his funeral suit, armed with measuring tape and camera. The breaking point came when Marcus spotted a young groundskeeper pushing a mower near Emma's section. The man appeared to be in his 20s, with a kind of methodical efficiency that suggested he took pride in maintaining the cemetery's pristine appearance. Marcus approached him with the desperate energy of someone who had exhausted all reasonable explanations for an unreasonable situation. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying more authority than he had used in months. "I need you to look at something." The groundskeeper shut off his mower and turned, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirt-stained cloth. His name tag read Danny, and his expression held the patient politeness of someone accustomed to dealing with grieving families and their various concerns. "What can I help you with, sir?" Marcus led him to Emma's grave, his heart racing with anticipation. Finally, he would have an objective witness to confirm what his eyes had been telling him. The mound rose before them like an earthen accusation, impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "This grave," Marcus said, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "My daughter's grave. Look at it. Tell me this is normal." Danny crouched beside the headstone, running his hands over the elevated earth with practiced familiarity. His expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught something flickering behind his eyes, a recognition that he was trying to conceal. "Sometimes soil shifts after burial," Danny offered carefully, his words sounding rehearsed. "Rain, seasonal changes, roots from nearby trees. Graves can settle unevenly over the first year." "This isn't settling," Marcus snapped, his composure cracking like ice under pressure. "This is rising. I've been here every day for months. I know what this looked like yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. This ground is moving upward. The groundskeeper straightened slowly, glancing around as if checking for witnesses to their conversation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality. Less professional script, more human uncertainty. Sir, I've worked here for 3 years. I've seen a lot of unusual things, but graves don't typically. He trailed off, studying the mound again with obvious confusion. Have you noticed any other changes? Smells, sounds, anything else unusual? The question sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The fact that this experienced cemetery worker was taking his concerns seriously validated his fears, while simultaneously making them more terrifying. If the changes were real, if something was genuinely wrong with Emma's burial, what did that mean for her eternal rest? Just the elevation in the grass, Marcus replied, his anger giving way to a deeper anxiety. It's like something underneath is pushing upward, trying to break through. Danny nodded slowly, his professional mask slipping further. I'll need to report this to my supervisor. We might need to do some investigating, maybe bring in someone more experienced to take a look. What kind of investigating? Marcus demanded. The thought of strangers disturbing Emma's grave, even for legitimate reasons, made his protective instincts flare. I won't have her peace disrupted unless absolutely necessary. Sir, if there's really something wrong with the burial site, if the casket is shifted or there's been some kind of structural failure, we need to address it properly, for your daughter's sake as much as yours. That afternoon, Marcus sat in the cemetery's administrative office, a sterile space that smelled of industrial carpet and bitter coffee. The director, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Chun, reviewed his photographs with the kind of professional detachment that comes from years of managing other people's grief. But even her composed expression showed cracks of concern as she studied the documentation of the grave's transformation. Mr. Hartwell, I want to assure you that we take any irregularities in our burial sites very seriously, she said, setting down his phone with careful precision. What you've documented here is certainly unusual, and it warrants investigation. What kind of investigation? Marcus repeated the question he had asked Danny, but this time his voice carried the weight of a father's desperation rather than anger. We would need to carefully excavate the site to determine what's causing the elevation. It could be anything from groundwater issues to problems with the vault system. Our priority would be to ensure the integrity of your daughter's final resting place. The word excavate hit Marcus like a physical blow. The image of strangers with shovels standing over Emma's grave, disturbing the carefully arranged peace he had tried to build around her memory, was almost unbearable. But the alternative, allowing whatever was wrong to continue unchecked, seemed equally impossible. How long would something like that take? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It depends on what we find. Could be a few hours, could be longer. We would handle everything with the utmost respect and dignity. And, of course, we would coordinate with you throughout the entire process. Marcus stared out the office window at the cemetery grounds, where other families moved between headstones in their own rituals of remembrance. Somewhere out there, Emma lay beneath earth that refused to remain still, and he was the only one who seemed capable of fighting for her peace. When can we do this? He asked, the words feeling like stones in his throat. Mrs. Chin consulted her calendar, marking dates with the efficiency of someone who had scheduled too many difficult conversations. We could arrange for a crew next Tuesday, early morning before regular visiting hours. That way we can work with privacy and minimal disruption to other families. As Marcus left the administrative office, an authorization form folded in his jacket pocket, he felt as though he was betraying Emma somehow. But the mystery of her rising grave had become unbearable, and he knew that discovering the truth was the only way to restore the peace they both desperately needed. Tuesday morning arrived with a kind of gray, overcast sky that seemed appropriate for disturbing the dead. Marcus stood beside Emma's grave at 6:30 in the morning, watching a small crew of cemetery workers unload their equipment from a maintenance truck. The mound had grown even more pronounced over the weekend, now rising nearly 8 inches above the surrounding earth, its surface covered with grass, so green it looked almost fluorescent in the pale dawn light. Mrs. Chin had arrived early to oversee the excavation personally, her usually pristine business attire replaced by practical clothes suitable for outdoor work. She approached Marcus with the kind of gentle authority that suggested she had managed similar situations before, though her uncertain expression implied that this particular case was outside her normal experience. "Mr. Hartwell, I want to walk through our process once more before we begin," she said, consulting a clipboard with bureaucratic precision. "We'll work carefully and methodically, documenting everything as we go. If we encounter anything unexpected, we'll pause to reassess the situation." Marcus nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. He had spent the previous night lying awake, alternating between relief that the mystery would finally be solved and terror about what might be discovered beneath the swollen earth. Sarah had held his hand in the darkness, neither of them voicing the horrible possibilities that lurked at the edges of their imagination. The lead excavator, a weathered man named Rodriguez, who had been working cemeteries for over 2 decades, positioned his crew around the grave with practiced efficiency. 3 workers with hand tools would carefully remove the elevated soil layer by layer, while a 4th documented the process with photographs and measurements. Everything would be recorded, analyzed, and explained through proper channels. "Remember," Rodriguez addressed his team, "we're not just digging here. We're conducting an investigation that affects a family's peace of mind. Respect and precision above all else." The first shovel broke ground with a soft, wet sound that made Marcus's stomach clench. The soil came away in dark clumps, revealing earth that looked freshly turned despite having been undisturbed for months. As each layer was carefully removed, the strange vitality of the mound became more apparent. The dirt was rich and loamy, shot through with what appeared to be an unusually dense network of thin, pale roots. "Sir," one of the workers called to Rodriguez, his voice carrying a note of confusion, "you need to see this." Rodriguez approached the partially excavated site and knelt beside the worker, examining what had been uncovered. Marcus pressed closer, his heart hammering as he tried to understand what they were looking at. The roots weren't random or scattered as they would be from nearby trees. Instead, they formed an organized network, running in deliberate patterns through the soil above Emma's casket. "These aren't from the cemetery landscaping," Rodriguez muttered, carefully tracing one of the thicker root strands with his finger. "They're too fresh, too purposeful, almost like they were planted here." The excavation continued with increased caution, each shovelful of earth revealing more of the mysterious root system. As the workers dug deeper, they uncovered fragments of what appeared to be broken pottery, small terracotta pieces mixed with the soil, as if a plant container had been crushed and scattered throughout the grave site. Marcus felt his legs give out, and he sank to his knees beside the excavation. A memory was fighting its way to the surface of his consciousness, something he had forgotten in the overwhelming trauma of Emma's death and burial. Something important that he should have remembered weeks ago. "Stop digging," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of careful excavation work. "Sir," Rodriguez looked up, concern creasing his weathered features. "Stop digging," Marcus repeated, louder this time. His voice cracked with emotion as the suppressed memory finally broke through. "I know what this is." The workers paused, their tools suspended above the earth as they waited for him to explain. Mrs. Chin approached cautiously, her professional composure wavering in the face of Marcus's obvious distress. "Mr. Hartwell, what do you mean? Do you know what's causing the elevation?" Marcus closed his eyes, allowing the memory to wash over him with painful clarity. Emma's bedroom, 3 days after the funeral, while Sarah was making arrangements with relatives, and he was wandering through the house like a ghost. On Emma's windowsill, forgotten their grief, had been her most treasured possession, a small potted sapling that she had been nurturing for months. She had found it as a seedling during one of their hiking trips the previous spring, carefully transplanting it into a simple terracotta pot that she kept beside her bedroom window. Every morning, she would water it religiously before school, talking to it as if it could understand her dreams and fears. She had named it Hope, claiming that something so determined to grow despite its small size deserved a name that reflected its spirit. "It's a tree," Marcus said, his voice breaking as tears began to stream down his face. "My daughter planted a tree. She must have. Someone must have put it in her casket, her little sapling." The revelation hung in the morning air like a prayer, transforming the excavation from a potential desecration into something approaching miracle. Rodriguez and his crew exchanged glances, unsure whether to continue digging or wait for further instructions. Mrs. Chun knelt beside Marcus, her professional detachment giving way to genuine compassion. "Mr. Hartwell, are you saying you believe a plant was buried with your daughter?" Marcus nodded, unable to trust his voice as the full implications of the discovery settled over him. Emma's grave hadn't been disturbed by vandals or compromised by structural failure. It was growing because she had left behind life in the most literal sense possible, a living thing that refused to remain buried, that pushed upward through the earth with the same determination she had shown in everything she attempted. The roots they had uncovered weren't invading her resting place. They were extending from it, reaching toward sunlight and air with the unstoppable force of life itself. Emma had always said that trees lived forever, that even when people were gone, the things they planted would continue growing. She had been more prophetic than any of them could have imagined. "What do you want us to do?" Rodriguez asked gently, his crew waiting for direction as the morning sun finally broke through the overcast sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. Marcus looked at the partially excavated grave, at the network of roots that represented his daughter's final gift to the world, and made the only decision that honored both her memory and her dreams. "Don't remove it," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Let it grow." The excavation crew exchanged uncertain glances, clearly outside the bounds of their normal procedures. Rodriguez consulted quietly with Mrs. Chun, while Marcus remained kneeling beside the partially excavated grave, his hands pressed against the rich soil that had yielded Emma's secret. The morning sun continued its ascent, warming the earth and illuminating the network of roots that had been fighting their way toward the surface for months. "Mr. Hartwell," Mrs. Chun said carefully, "I understand your emotional response to this discovery, but we need to consider the cemetery's regulations and long-term maintenance requirements. A tree growing from a grave site could create complications for surrounding plots, not to mention potential damage to the burial vault itself." Marcus looked up at her, his grief transformed into something approaching fierce protectiveness. "This is my daughter's final wish. She planted this sapling. She cared for it, and somehow it ended up buried with her. If you think I'm going to let you destroy the last living piece of her, you don't understand what being a father means." The conviction in his voice seemed to resonate with Rodriguez, who had spent 2 decades managing the delicate intersection of death and bureaucracy. The older man stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful as he studied the root system they had uncovered. "Ma'am," Rodriguez addressed Mrs. Chun, "in all my years doing this work, I've never seen anything quite like this. The way these roots are growing, the vitality of the soil, the fact that the tree has managed to survive burial and continue developing underground. It's remarkable, maybe even miraculous." Mrs. Chin frowned, consulting her clipboard as if cemetery regulations might provide guidance for this unprecedented situation. But the maintenance issues, the precedent this might set for other families wanting to plant things on grave sites. "This isn't about setting precedents," Marcus interrupted, rising to his feet with renewed strength. "This is about respecting what my daughter left behind. She always said that trees live forever, that they're the closest thing to eternal life that exists in nature. She was 18 years old when she died, but she had the wisdom to plant something that would outlive her." Throughout this conversation, the excavation crew had remained silent, their tools at rest as they witnessed a debate that would determine the fate of their unusual discovery. One of the younger workers, a man barely older than Emma had been, spoke up quietly. "My grandmother always said that when someone plants a tree, they're expressing faith in the future. This girl, she was planning for a tomorrow she wouldn't see." The simple observation seemed to shift something in the atmosphere of the cemetery. Mrs. Chun looked around at the faces surrounding Emma's grave, the crew waiting for guidance, Marcus radiating protective determination, Rodriguez nodding with the wisdom of experience. The morning had transformed from a routine problem-solving exercise into something approaching sacred ground. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Hartwell?" she asked, her tone suggesting genuine consideration rather than bureaucratic resistance. Marcus knelt again beside the excavated earth, carefully brushing soil away from one of the thicker root strands. "I want to give it every chance to grow. Remove enough soil to prevent the roots from being constrained, but leave the system intact. Let nature take its course. The cemetery would need to modify our landscaping approach for this section," Mrs. Chen warned, "and there could be complications as the tree grows larger. Root systems can be extensive, potentially affecting neighboring plots." "Then we'll deal with those complications when they arise," Marcus replied. "But we won't deny my daughter the chance to leave something beautiful in this world." Rodriguez was already calculating the practical modifications needed. "We could create a raised planting bed around the grave site, extend the excavation carefully to give the root system room to develop without disturbing surrounding plots. It would require some creative landscaping, but it's doable." The decision, once made, transformed the entire character of the morning's work. Instead of problem-solving excavation, the crew began careful cultivation, removing soil strategically to support the sapling's growth, while preserving the integrity of Emma's resting place. Mrs. Chin made phone calls to supervisors and regulatory agencies, navigating the bureaucratic requirements for creating what would become the cemetery's first official memorial tree. Over the following weeks, Marcus's daily visits took on an entirely different character. Instead of arriving with grief and leaving with greater sorrow, he came armed with watering cans and gardening tools. The cemetery had agreed to let him tend the emerging tree personally, recognizing that his involvement was essential to the success of this unprecedented memorial. Sarah began joining him on weekends, initially skeptical of the arrangement, but gradually won over by the undeniable symbolism of life emerging from death. They would work together in companionable silence, clearing weeds from around the developing root system and protecting the young growth from harsh weather. The first visible shoot broke through the surface on a crisp November morning, a slender green stem no thicker than Marcus's finger, but reaching determinedly toward the sky. He wept when he saw it, calling Sarah at work to share the news, with the excitement of a father announcing his child's first steps. Word of the memorial tree spread through the cemetery's community of regular visitors, many of whom began stopping by Emma's grave to witness the unusual sight of life literally rising from death. An elderly woman who tended her husband's nearby plot began bringing small offerings, plant food, protective mulch, words of encouragement spoken to both Emma and her growing legacy. By Christmas, the sapling had grown to nearly 2 feet in height, its branches beginning to spread in a delicate canopy above the grave site. Marcus had researched the species, a young oak that Emma had rescued during one of their hiking expeditions, and learned that it could potentially live for centuries, becoming a living monument that would outlast every stone marker in the cemetery. On the first anniversary of Emma's death, Marcus stood beneath the young tree's shade, no longer wearing his funeral suit, but dressed in the practical clothes of a gardener. The oak was thriving, its roots having established a complex network that enriched the soil throughout the surrounding area. Other families had begun requesting permission to plant memorial trees, inspired by Emma's example. "You kept your promise, sweetheart," Marcus said quietly, his hand resting on the tree's smooth bark. "Something you planted really is going to live forever." The wind rustled through the oak's leaves, a sound that Marcus chose to interpret as his daughter's laughter, carried on the air like a blessing for all the tomorrows she had made possible. In creating this living memorial, Emma had given her father something he hadn't realized he needed, not just a way to remember her, but a way to watch her continue growing, reaching toward light, becoming more beautiful with each passing season. The mystery of the rising grave had become the miracle of eternal growth.